John had always prided himself on his calm demeanor and ability to handle the chaos of the legal world with ease, but this morning felt different. As he walked into his office, he was greeted by an unexpected knock at the door. Before he could even respond, the door swung open, and two uniformed officers entered with serious expressions. One of them spoke with an authority that sent a chill through his spine. "Mr. John Carter, we are placing you under arrest." John froze, his mind racing in disbelief, the words barely making sense. The officers didn't wait for any questions or clarification. They just started reading the charges. John's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of what was happening. This was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But there was no way to explain it, not yet, not in the way that would make them listen. At least John had been a criminal defense lawyer for years. He had seen the system at its worst. He knew the way it could twist and manipulate people's lives. But never had he imagined he would be on the other side of it. The thought felt almost unreal. He was a professional, a man who spent his life fighting for justice, not a criminal. John stood there motionless, his mind still grasping for some logical explanation for the surreal events unfolding before him. The officers continued with their formalities, one of them reading the list of charges while the other kept his eyes fixed on John, waiting for some sort of reaction. But John didn't give them the satisfaction. He remained quiet. The more they spoke, the less he could comprehend. The accusations sounded foreign, disconnected from his life. As a lawyer, his career had been built on facts and evidence. He knew that, but none of this made sense, none of it connected to anything he had ever done or been a part of. The officers escorted him out of his office as the murmurs of surprise and confusion spread among his colleagues. Some of them watched from behind glass doors, others whispered in disbelief. But John could only focus on the footsteps that echoed through the hallway with every step. He took the weight of the situation pressed down on him harder and harder, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. He was led to the squad car. Without a word exchanged, he wasn't sure what was worse, the shock of being arrested, or the humiliation of the entire office watching him, as though he was guilty of something they all expected him to deny his innocence. But how could he do that when he didn't even know what he was accused of? He was just a lawyer doing his job. Why was he suddenly in this position? Why were they treating him like this? He tried to make sense of it, but his thoughts were clouded with frustration and confusion. As the car doors slammed shut and they drove away, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far bigger than just a misunderstanding, something that no one had yet seen. As the car made its way toward the police station, John's mind began to race through all the cases he had worked on over the years. Was there anyone he had crossed paths with who might want to see him out of the picture? Was there someone with a vendetta, someone who had the power to set this entire process in motion? He couldn't think of anyone not like this, not in the way they were treating him. This wasn't just about some petty legal dispute, this was something else. And it was only just beginning to dawn on him that maybe he held the key to something much bigger than his own freedom. A dark thought entered his mind, a possibility he didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore. Maybe this wasn't just about him, maybe it was about something much darker than anything he had ever been involved in. As John was led into the police station, he tried to steady his breathing. His heart was racing, and his thoughts were scattered in 1,000 directions. But there was one thing that stood out, the mention of a missing person. As the officers had read out the charges, it was the only part of their accusations that had made any sense. The name had struck a chord with him, but he couldn't place it right away. It was a name he had seen before somewhere in his legal work, but where the interrogation room was cold and sterile. As John was seated across from two detectives who seemed far too calm for the situation, the man sitting closest to him cleared his throat and began speaking in a voice that was almost too smooth to be genuine. "Mr. Carter, we have some questions for you about a case we are currently investigating." John listened intently, but his mind was still racing back to that name. The missing person, the name had popped into his head. Suddenly, a connection he hadn't noticed before, a case he had worked on some years ago. It was a case he had nearly forgotten, but now it felt like it had resurfaced in the most unexpected way. His legal expertise had been called on back then to advise on some complicated financial transactions involving a shady company. He had thought little of it at the time, but now he couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just a coincidence. The detectives continued speaking, but John was no longer fully listening. He was piecing things together in his mind. Trying to connect the dots, he was beginning to understand that the missing person was no accident. This wasn't just a random case. This was a pattern, something far larger and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. But how did he fit into all of this? Why was he now the one sitting in this interrogation room, accused of something he hadn't done? John's thoughts were interrupted by one of the detectives, as they finally addressed the very thing he had feared. "You were involved in a case a few years back involving a company that was linked to the missing person's family." The detective said. His words were sharp and calculated. John's chest tightened, his eyes narrowing as the pieces finally fell into place. He hadn't made the connection earlier, but now it was so clear. The company he had advised on was part of something much more sinister than just a few shady business practices. It was a front for a network of criminals involved in illegal activities that ranged from human trafficking to money laundering. And worse, the name of the missing person was tied to this operation. They were more than just a casualty. They were a victim of a larger conspiracy that John had barely scratched the surface of when he had helped with the legal side of the case years ago. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This was no coincidence. This was all connected. And somehow he was caught in the middle of it all. John looked up at the detectives, his mind racing, but his face unreadable. He needed to keep his composure. He needed to stay focused. This wasn't about him. This was about the person who had gone missing and the people who were responsible for their disappearance. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He knew now that his involvement in the case was not just a matter of bad luck. He was the key to something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The detectives pressed on with their questions, but John could hardly concentrate on their words. His mind kept returning to the missing person. He could picture their face clearly in his mind. He had seen their name on the legal documents long ago, but now it meant something entirely different. He had a sinking feeling that if he could help the police understand what he knew about the company's operations, he could solve this mystery and bring those responsible to justice. But doing so meant revealing information he wasn't sure the police were ready for. He had to be careful. This was no longer just a legal case. It was a fight for his own survival. John sat in the cold room, his mind spinning as the detectives continued to question him. Their words felt distant, like a muffled noise that he couldn't quite grasp. The image of the missing person kept resurfacing in his mind, and it wasn't just their face that haunted him, but the connection he had made between their disappearance and the shady company he had helped advise years ago. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. He had worked on that case in good faith, helping the company navigate through legal obstacles. But now it seemed clear that there had been far more going on behind the scenes than anyone could have imagined at the time. John began to wonder if he had unknowingly helped cover up a far larger criminal operation, a thought that made his stomach churn. He had always considered himself a man of integrity, someone who fought for justice. But this felt different. This wasn't just a case of legal missteps. This was a matter of life and death, and he was somehow tangled up in it. All he could feel the pressure building with every passing second. The detectives were waiting for him to respond to their questions, but John couldn't bring himself to speak. Not yet, not until he was certain about what was really happening. The missing person's name was echoing in his mind again. He remembered it now. It had been on a list of people connected to the company during his time advising them, but he had dismissed it as irrelevant back then. They had been a minor player in the grand scheme of things, just another name among many. But now he understood the significance of that name and the terrifying implications it carried. The missing person wasn't just a victim. They were part of a much larger story, one that tied back to the company's illegal activities that he had never fully understood until now. John looked up at the detectives. They were still talking, but their words felt like they were coming from far away. He knew he had to act fast. He had to find a way to prove his innocence. But more than that, he needed to stop whatever was happening to the missing person. He couldn't let them become another casualty of this ruthless network he had unknowingly helped protect. But how could he explain it to the police without revealing too much? He had to be careful. If he spoke out of turn, they might think he was guilty, or worse, that he was involved in the operation itself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep the conspiracy went. The company he had once worked with was just one part of a much larger criminal syndicate, one that had its fingers in every corner of the city: human trafficking, drug smuggling, illegal weapons, and money laundering. They were all tied together in a web of deceit and manipulation, and John had just stumbled upon the tip of the iceberg. He needed to take a step back, think this through, but his mind was racing too fast. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with every passing moment. The detectives weren't letting up. They wanted answers. They wanted him to help them crack the case. But John wasn't sure he could give them the answers they wanted without putting himself in even more danger. If they knew what he really knew about the company and its connections to the missing person, would they believe him? Or would they think he was covering up his involvement? He needed to be careful. Every word mattered. But he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. If he had any chance of helping the police uncover the truth, he had to take the risk. He had to trust that they would see the bigger picture before it was too late. But first he needed to find a way to communicate that this was bigger than just a missing person case. This was about something far darker, and he was the one who held the key to unraveling it all. John could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The detectives weren't making it easy. They kept asking questions he couldn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know where to begin. He knew too much, and yet not enough. He had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple case of financial fraud or legal missteps, and he wasn't sure how much the police would even understand about the dangerous web he had unknowingly become tangled in. The detectives were growing impatient, their questions more insistent as time wore on, and John felt the pressure mounting with every passing minute. He had to speak. He had to tell them something, but he couldn't give them the whole truth, not yet, not without putting himself in greater danger. His mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to navigate this without revealing too much. But all he could see was the image of the missing person, their face staring at him from the fog of his memory. John felt a surge of urgency. He couldn't just sit there while someone was out there somewhere in danger. He couldn't live with himself if he let this go any longer. But he knew the risks. If he said the wrong thing, if he revealed too much too soon, they might think he was part of it all. They might arrest him again. And this time there would be no getting out of it. He had to find a way to prove his worth to them without exposing himself as a suspect. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and spoke slowly, looking the detective in the eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know who's behind this," he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. The detectives stopped talking for a moment, staring at him as if they had never heard such a statement before. John's heart was pounding, but he didn't let the fear show. He needed them to take him seriously. He had to make them understand that what they were dealing with was bigger than just a missing person or a few crooked businessmen. They were chasing something much more dangerous, something that no one had yet fully grasped. The detective closest to him leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone skeptical, but with a hint of curiosity. John could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was time to take the risk, time to plant the seed of truth, even if it meant walking a dangerous line. "I've seen the connections," he continued slowly. "The company, the one I worked with a few years ago, they're just the front for something much bigger, a criminal network so vast and so well organized no one will see it coming." John felt a chill run down his spine. As the words left his mouth, the room was silent for a moment, as if the detectives were processing what he had just said. The man sitting across from him exchanged a quick glance with his partner, then turned back to John, clearly trying to decide if they should believe him or not. But John didn't care. He knew what he had to do. He knew that this was his only chance to stop the madness before it got worse. The company wasn't just involved in fraud or money laundering. It was the hub of a criminal empire. It was involved in human trafficking, arms dealing, everything that no one was willing to admit existed right under their noses. John leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're looking at a network that stretches across the city, maybe the country. And I'm telling you, I have the pieces of the puzzle in front of me. I can help you put it together. But you need to trust me." He finished his words with a finality that seemed to hang in the air between them. The detectives sat back in their chairs, still unsure of how to respond. The tension in the room was palpable, but John knew this was his chance. If they believed him, he could help them stop whatever was coming. If they didn't, if they dismissed him, he might never get another chance to make things right. And worse still, the missing person might never be found alive. The silence in the room stretched out longer than John could handle. The detectives were looking at him as though he had just said something incomprehensible, or worse, something they didn't believe. But he knew that they had to understand he wasn't lying. Every word he spoke was truth. And now it was time for them to see that he was the one who could lead them to the heart of the criminal empire they were chasing. The detective closest to him leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "How do we know you're not involved in this yourself?" he asked, his voice sharp. John's chest tightened at the question, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to prove he wasn't a part of this twisted game. He had to show them that he was their ally, not their enemy. His hands gripped the edge of the table as he looked the detective squarely in the eye. "Because I don't need to be involved to see what's happening," he said, his voice steady, but with an underlying urgency. "I've been following the legal trail for years now, and it's all connected to this company. They used me. I didn't know what they were really doing at the time, but I know now the people involved in this are ruthless, and they're capable of anything. They won't stop until they've buried everyone who stands in their way." The detectives exchanged another look, still unsure of whether to believe him or not, but this time there was a shift in their posture, just a small change, as though they were starting to process what he was saying. John could feel it, a crack in their skepticism, just enough for him to press forward. "If you don't believe me, go back and look at the company's financials, look at their business dealings. The patterns are all there, the strings that tie everything together. I've seen them, and I can help you connect them if you let me." John's voice was low, but the conviction in his words was undeniable. He needed them to understand this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just another criminal case. This was the result of years of manipulation and deceit on a scale that they couldn't yet comprehend. The detective sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The tension in the room was thick, but John didn't back down. He couldn't afford to if he wanted to stop whatever was coming next. He needed them to listen to him completely. The other detective, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly spoke. His tone was more measured than before. "All right," he said, his voice steady, "we'll look into it. But you need to understand this. We can't afford to be led down the wrong path again. If you're feeding us false information or trying to cover your tracks, you'll be held accountable for everything that happens next." John nodded without hesitation. "I understand," he said, "and you'll see that I'm right. I can't make you trust me, but you will soon enough. And when you do, you'll realize that I'm the only one who can help you catch these people. The only one who knows how deep this goes." The detectives didn't respond right away. They exchanged another long look before the one who had spoken first finally stood up. "All right, Mr. Carter, we'll take your information seriously, but don't think for a second that you're off the hook. You're still a suspect in the missing person case until we can confirm otherwise." John nodded once more, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew he hadn't won their trust yet, but he had planted the seed of doubt in their minds. And now he had to make sure they watered it, because if they believed him, if they followed the trail he had pointed them to, the people behind this conspiracy would be exposed for what they truly were: ruthless, dangerous, and willing to do anything to protect their empire. But John wasn't afraid anymore. He had come too far to turn back now, and he knew that no matter what the consequences were, he couldn't walk away from this. He had to finish what he had started, because lives were on the line, and he was the one who could stop it all from spiraling out of control. As the detectives left the room, John was left alone with his thoughts. The tension in his chest wouldn't ease. It felt like his entire life had been flipped upside down, and he couldn't escape the feeling that every minute that passed made the situation more dangerous. For the missing person, he had seen the connections in the past, the subtle hints that had once been so easy to ignore. But now they were staring him in the face, glaringly obvious, like a warning sign that no one had noticed until it was too late. His mind raced back to the files he had once worked with, the business deals, the shady transactions, the people involved in them. They were all linked together, and he had been right in the middle of it all, helping to cover their tracks without even realizing it. He had been a pawn in their game, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. The detective's words echoed in his mind. "You're still a suspect in the missing person case until we can confirm otherwise." It was a reminder that John wasn't out of the woods, yet he knew he had to keep his composure, No matter how overwhelming the situation became, he couldn't let his fear show, not to the detectives, not to anyone, but inside he was scared, more scared than he had ever been before, because he knew how high the stakes were. If they didn't act quickly, the missing person might be lost forever, or worse, caught in the crossfire of the criminal empire. He had just begun to uncover. John rubbed his hands together, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't afford to panic, not now. The next step was critical. He had to get the police to trust him enough to follow the trail he had given them. But it wasn't going to be easy. They needed proof. They needed something concrete, something that would tie everything together. And that was where John's expertise came in. If anyone could find the missing link, it was him. He just had to figure out how to get them to understand the gravity of what they were dealing with. They couldn't keep following the same old leads. They had to see the bigger picture. And for that, John needed their full cooperation. He needed to be their ally completely, not just a suspect or a source of information. He needed to convince them that they were on the brink of uncovering something that would change everything, and that they couldn't do it without him. But that wasn't the only problem. John knew that the deeper they dug into this case, the more dangerous it would become. The people behind the company and the missing person's disappearance weren't just criminals. They were powerful. They had connections everywhere. And if they knew that John had started to figure things out, he wouldn't just be a suspect anymore. He would be a target. The threat felt real and palpable. As John thought about it, the shadows seemed to creep closer around him. But he couldn't let fear paralyze him. Not when there was so much at stake. He had already taken a step forward. There was no turning back now. John knew the next move had to be perfect if he wanted to stop the criminals and save the missing person. But he also knew that with every step he took, the danger would escalate. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him from every corner of the room. He couldn't let it overwhelm him. He had to stay focused. He had to stay sharp. As the door creaked open and the detectives returned, John steeled himself. He had one chance to make them see the truth. He wasn't just a lawyer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was their best shot at stopping the people who would do anything to silence the truth. And they needed to listen to him if they wanted to save the missing person and everyone else who was about to get caught in the crossfire. The detectives entered the room again. Their faces were more serious than before. John could tell they had been talking about him during their brief absence, and though they didn't show it, they were starting to take him more seriously. One of them spoke, the man who had been skeptical earlier, his voice low and controlled. "We've looked into some of what you said," he began. "There's definitely something strange going on. We can't ignore it anymore." John felt a flicker of hope, but he quickly squashed it. The last thing he wanted was for his hopes to get too high only to be let down again. He had seen enough of the system to know how easily things could go wrong. The other detective remained silent for the moment, his eyes fixed on John, as if waiting for him to say more. But John wasn't sure how to proceed. He had told them everything he could without giving away too much about the extent of the operation, the illegal activities, the people involved. He couldn't afford to expose too much yet, not until they were fully committed to taking down the entire network. He needed them to be all in or nothing at all. "You're right," John said, his voice steady. "It's not just about the missing person anymore. It's about a much bigger operation. There are more victims out there. You need to act fast, or you'll lose them. And once they're gone, it'll be too late for anyone to find them." The detectives exchanged another glance before one of them nodded, their face hardening. "We're already working on it," he said, his voice more resolute than before. "We've put some of your information together, and we've got a lead. We're moving on it as we speak." John felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. They were listening to him. But he knew they were only beginning to understand the full scale of what they were dealing with, and they had no idea how dangerous it was going to get. He had to keep them focused on the goal, keep them from getting distracted by the small details that would only slow them down. They had to stay ahead of the criminals before the criminals found them. But John knew that time was slipping away with every passing second. The people behind the operation were too well organized. They had been operating in the shadows for years, and now they were getting bolder. John wasn't sure how much longer he had before the criminals realized they were being hunted, but he knew it couldn't be long. The walls were closing in on both sides, and the pressure was only building. Still, he knew he had to keep pushing forward. He couldn't afford to lose momentum, not now, When they were so close to cracking this wide open, he turned to the detectives and spoke again. Make sure you're looking in the right places. Focus on the people behind the company, the ones who really pulled the strings. They've been hiding in plain sight the whole time. And if you dig deep enough, you'll see their fingerprints on everything. But they're good, they're dangerous. They won't hesitate to erase anyone who gets in their way. If you want to stop them, you need to stay one step ahead. Always. John's words hung in the air between them like a challenge. But the detectives didn't flinch. They were listening now. And for the first time, John felt like they were truly on the same side. They didn't just want to solve a case. They wanted to stop something much bigger, something that could destroy everything if they weren't careful. But the fear that had been gnawing at him since he had first been arrested was still there, gnawing away at him in the back of his mind. The missing person was still out there somewhere, and they had no time to waste if they wanted to save them from whatever the criminals had planned. Next, the door swung open again, and a uniformed officer entered the room, his face grim. "We've got another lead," he said, his voice tight. "It's tied to the company. We think they might be moving the missing person right now." John's heart skipped a beat. They didn't have much time. They had to act fast before it was too late. The room erupted in action. As soon as the officer spoke, John felt his pulse race and his mind scramble into overdrive. This was at the moment they had all been waiting for. The missing person wasn't just a cold case anymore. They were alive and somewhere out there, but time was running out. John could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Every second that passed brought them closer to losing everything. He had been caught up in a world of shadows and lies for too long, but now he had a chance to make it right. He had a chance to stop the people responsible for everything and save a life. But the pressure to act was unbearable. He glanced at the detectives. Their faces were focused now, no longer filled with doubt. They were ready to move. They had to move. They didn't have the luxury of time. And John knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They needed to catch up to the criminals before they disappeared again, or worse, before they erased all evidence of the person's existence. The detective in charge turned to John, his voice commanding. "We need your help. We've got the location, but we don't know how far they've gotten yet. You've seen their operations before. You know how they think." John nodded, his throat dry, but he forced the words out. "I know how they operate. I know how to get to them. But it's going to be dangerous. It's not just a simple rescue. This is an entire network we're up against, and they won't hesitate to fight back." The stakes were higher than ever, and every word John spoke felt heavier than the last one. This was it, the final confrontation with the criminals who had been pulling the strings all along, the same ones he had unknowingly aided in the past. But this time he wasn't going to sit back and let them win. This time he was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. The detective nodded again. "We've got backup coming in, but we need to move fast. The clock is ticking." John could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he thought about what lay ahead. They were going to walk straight into the lion's den. But he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to taking down the whole operation. He led the detectives to the parking lot, where they were met with a convoy of officers ready to go. They piled into their vehicles and sped off toward the location John had given them. It was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a place he knew well from his time advising the company. It had been a front for their illegal activities for years, and John had always known there was something sinister about the place. Now he understood the full extent of its purpose. It wasn't just a warehouse, it was a hub, a place where they conducted their most illegal dealings. And now it was the place where they were holding the missing person. John's stomach churned with the thought of what they might have done to them. But there was no time to dwell on it now. All that mattered was getting in and getting them out before it was too late. The convoy arrived at the location, the warehouse looming ahead. Like a fortress, John felt a chill run down his spine. As they pulled to a stop, he had been here before, but this time it was different. This time, he wasn't just a part of the operation. This time, he was there to end it all. He turned to the detectives and spoke quietly. "We need to be smart, we need to move fast, and we need to be prepared for anything. These people don't play by the rules, and neither will we." With that, the officers moved into position. John's heart raced as he followed behind them into the darkness of the warehouse, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the hollow space ahead of them. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt wrong, like the calm before the storm. But John wasn't afraid, not anymore. He had come too far to back down now, And no matter what he faced in that warehouse, he was going to finish this once and for all. He wasn't going to let them hurt anyone else, and he wasn't going to let them get away with everything they had done. They moved deeper into the warehouse, and then they heard the sound of footsteps, the unmistakable sound of people moving in the shadows. Suddenly the calm was shattered, and the final confrontation began.